Chapter 6 of Tik-Tok of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Sherris. Tik-Tok of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 6. Shaggy Seeks His Stray Brother. This sudden arrival was a queer-looking man, dressed all in garments so shaggy that Betsy at first thought he must be some animal, but the stranger ended his fall in a sitting position, and then the girl saw it was really a man. He held an apple in his hand, which he had evidently been eating when he fell, and so little was he jarred or flustered by the accident that he continued to munch this apple as he calmly looked around him. "Good gracious!" exclaimed Betsy, approaching him. "Who are you, and where did you come from?"
"Me? Oh, I'm Shaggy Man," said he, taking another bite of the apple. "Just dropped in for a short call. Excuse my seeming haste."
"Why, I suppose you couldn't help the haste," said Betsy.
"No, I climbed an apple tree outside. Branch gave way, and here I am."
As he spoke, the Shaggy Man finished his apple, gave the core to Hank, who ate it greedily, and then stood up to bow politely to Betsy and the roses. The royal gardener had been frightened nearly into fits by the crash of glass and the fall of the shaggy stranger into the bower of roses, but now he peeped out from behind a bush and cried in his squeaky voice, "You're breaking the law! You're breaking the law!" Shaggy stared at him solemnly.
"Is glass the law in this country?" he asked.
"Breaking the glass is breaking the law," squeaked the gardener angrily. "Also, to intrude in any part of the Rose Kingdom is breaking the law."
"How do you know?" asked Shaggy.
"Why, it's printed in a book," said the gardener, coming forward and taking a small book from his pocket. "Page 13. Here it is. If any stranger enters the Rose Kingdom, he shall at once be condemned by the ruler and put to death. So you see, strangers," he continued triumphantly, "it's death for you, and your time has come." But just here Hank interposed. He had been stealthily backing toward the royal gardener, whom he disliked, and now the mule's heels shot out and struck the little man in the middle. He doubled up like the letter U and flew out the door so swiftly, never touching the ground, that he was gone before Betsy had time to wink. But the mule's attack frightened the girl. "Come," she whispered, approaching the Shaggy Man and taking his hand. "Let's go somewhere else. They'll surely kill us if we stay here."
"Don't worry, my dear," replied Shaggy, patting the child's head. "I'm not afraid of anything so long as I have the love magnet."
"The love magnet? Why, what is that?" asked Betsy.
"It's a charming little enchantment that wins the heart of everyone who looks upon it," was the reply. "The love magnet used to hang over the gateway to the Emerald City in the Land of Oz, but when I started on this journey, our beloved ruler, Ozma of Oz, allowed me to take it with me."
"Oh!" cried Betsy, staring hard at him. "Are you really from the wonderful Land of Oz?"
"Yes. Ever been there, my dear?"
"No, but I've heard about it. And do you know Princess Ozma?"
"Very well indeed."
And Princess Dorothy?"
"Dorothy's an old chum of mine," declared Shaggy.
"Dear me!" exclaimed Betsy. "And why did you ever leave such a beautiful land as Oz?"
"On an errand," said Shaggy, looking sad and solemn. "I'm trying to find my dear little brother."
"Oh, is he lost?" questioned Betsy, feeling very sorry for the poor man.
"Been lost these 10 years,"
replied Shaggy, taking out a handkerchief and wiping a tear from his eye.
"I didn't know it until lately, when I saw it recorded in the magic record book of the sorceress Glinda in the Land of Oz. So now I'm trying to find him."
"Where was he lost?" asked the girl sympathetically.
"Back in Colorado, where I used to live before I went to Oz. Brother was a miner and dug gold out of a mine. One day he went into his mine and never came out. They searched for him, but he was not there. Disappeared entirely,"
Shaggy ended miserably. "For goodness sake, what do you suppose became of him?" she asked.
"There is only one explanation,"
replied Shaggy, taking another apple from his pocket and eating it to relieve his misery.
"The Gnome King probably got him."
"The Gnome King? Who is he?"
"Why, he's sometimes called the Meadow Monarch, and his name is Ruggedo. Lives in some underground cavern. Claims to own all the metals hidden in the earth. Don't ask me why."
"Why?"
"'Cause I don't know. But this Ruggedo gets wild with anger if anyone digs gold out of the earth, and my private opinion is that he captured Brother and carried him to his underground kingdom. No, don't ask me why. I see you're dying to ask me why, but I don't know."
"But, dear me, in that case you will never find your lost brother!" exclaimed the girl.
"Maybe not, but it's my duty to try," answered Shaggy. "I've wandered so far without finding him, but that only proves he's not where I've been looking. What I seek now is the hidden passage to the underground cavern of the terrible Metal Monarch."
"Well," said Betsy doubtfully, "it strikes me that if you ever manage to get there, the Metal Monarch will make you too his prisoner."
"Nonsense!" answered Shaggy carelessly. "You mustn't forget the love magnet."
"What about it?" she asked.
"When the fierce Metal Monarch sees the love magnet, he will love me dearly and do anything I ask."
"It must be wonderful," said Betsy with awe.
"It is," the man assured her. "Shall I show it to you?"
"Oh, do!" she cried. So Shaggy searched in his shaggy pocket and drew out a small silver magnet, shaped like a horseshoe. The moment Betsy saw it, she began to like the Shaggy Man better than before. Hank also saw the magnet and crept up to Shaggy to rub his head lovingly against the man's knee. But they were interrupted by the royal gardener, who stuck his head in the greenhouse and shouted angrily, "You are all condemned to death! Your only chance to escape is to leave here instantly!" This startled little Betsy, but the Shaggy Man merely waved the magnet towards the gardener, who, seeing it, rushed forward and threw himself at Shaggy's feet, murmuring in honeyed words, "Oh, you lovely, lovely man! How fond I am of you! Every shag and bobtail that decorates you is dear to me. All I have is yours. But for goodness sake, get out of here before you die the death!"
"I'm not going to die," declared Shaggy Man.
"You must. It's the law!" exclaimed the gardener, beginning to weep real tears. "It breaks my heart to tell you this bad news, but the law says that all strangers must be condemned by the ruler to die the death." "No ruler has condemned us yet," said Betsy.
"Of course not," added Shaggy. "We haven't even seen the ruler of the Rose Kingdom."
"Well, to tell the truth," said the gardener in a perplexed tone of voice, "we haven't any real ruler just now. You see, all our rulers grow on the bushes in the royal gardens, and the last one we had got mildewed and withered before his time, so we had to plant him, and at this time there is no one growing on the royal bushes who is ripe enough to pick." "How do you know?" asked Betsy. "Why, I'm the royal gardener. Plenty of royalties are growing, I admit, but just now they are all green. Until one ripens, I'm supposed to rule the Rose Kingdom myself, and see that its laws are obeyed. Therefore, much as I love you, Shaggy, I must put you to death." "Wait a minute," pleaded Betsy. "I'd like to see these royal gardens before I die."
"So would I," added Shaggy Man. "Take us there, gardener."
"Oh, I can't do that," objected the gardener. But Shaggy again showed him the love magnet, and after one glance at it, the gardener could no longer resist. He led Shaggy, Betsy, and Hank to the end of the great greenhouse and carefully unlocked a small door. Passing through this, they came into the splendid royal garden of the Rose Kingdom. It was all surrounded by a tall hedge, and within the enclosure grew several enormous rose bushes having thick green leaves of the texture of velvet. Upon these bushes grew the members of the royal family of the Rose Kingdom, men, women, and children in all stages of maturity. They all seemed to have a light green hue, as if unripe or not fully developed, their flesh and clothing being alike green. They stood perfectly lifeless upon their branches, which swayed softly in the breeze, and their wide open eyes stared straight ahead, unseeing and unintelligent. While examining these curious growing people, Betsy passed behind a big central bush and at once uttered an exclamation of surprise and pleasure, for there, blooming in perfect color and shape, stood a royal princess whose beauty was amazing. "Why, she's ripe!" cried Betsy, pushing aside some of the broad leaves to observe her more clearly. "Well, perhaps so," admitted the gardener, who had come to the girl's side. "But she's a girl, and so we can't use her for a ruler."
No, indeed,
came a chorus of soft voices, and looking around, Betsy discovered that all the roses had followed them from a greenhouse and were now grouped before the entrance. "You see," explained the gardener, "the subjects of the Rose Kingdom don't want a girl ruler. They want a king."
A king. We want a king.
repeated the chorus of roses.
Isn't she royal?
Inquired Shaggy, admiring the lovely princess. Of course, for she grows on a royal bush. This princess is named Ozga, as she is a distant cousin of Ozma of Oz, and, were she but a man, we would joyfully hail her as our ruler. The gardener then turned away to talk with his roses, and Betsy whispered to her companion, "Let's pick her, Shaggy."
All right, said he. If she's royal, she has the right to rule this kingdom, and if we pick her, she will surely protect us and prevent our being hurt or driven away.
So Betsy and Shaggy each took an arm of the beautiful Rose Princess, and a little twist of her feet set her free of the branch upon which she grew. Very gracefully she stepped down from the bush to the ground, where she bowed low to Betsy and Shaggy, and said in a delightfully sweet voice, "I thank you." But at the sound of these words the gardener and the roses turned and discovered that the princess had been picked and was now alive. Over every face flashed an expression of resentment and anger, and one of the roses cried aloud, "Audacious mortals, what have you done?" "Picked a princess for you, that's all," replied Betsy cheerfully. "But we won't have her. We want a king!" exclaimed a Jacques Rose, and another added with a voice of scorn, "No girl shall rule over us." The newly picked princess looked from one to another of her rebellious subjects in astonishment. A grieved look came over her exquisite features. "Have I no welcome here, pretty subjects?" she asked gently. "Have I not come from my royal bush to be a ruler?" "You were picked by mortals without our consent," replied the moss rose coldly. "So we refuse to allow you to rule us."
"Turn her out, gardener, with the others!"
cried the tea rose.
"Just a second, please," called Shaggy, taking the love magnet from his pocket. "I guess this will win their love, Princess. Here, take it in your hand and let the roses see it."
Princess Ozga took the magnet and held it poised before the eyes of her subjects, but the roses regarded it with calm disdain.
"Why, what's the matter?" demanded Shaggy in surprise. "The magnet never failed to work before."
"I know," said Betsy, nodding her head wisely. "These roses have no hearts." "That's it," agreed the gardener. "They're pretty and sweet and alive, but still they are roses. Their stems have thorns, but no hearts." The princess sighed and handed the magnet to the Shaggy Man. "What shall I do?" she asked sorrowfully.
"Turn her out, gardener, with the others!"
commanded the roses. "We will have no ruler until a man rose, a king, is ripe enough to pick." "Very well," said the gardener meekly. "You must excuse me, my dear Shaggy, for opposing your wishes, but you and the others, including Ozga, must get out of the Rose Kingdom immediately, if not before."
"Don't you love me, Guardy?"
asked Shaggy, carelessly displaying the magnet. "I do, I dote on thee," answered the gardener earnestly. "But no true man will neglect his duty for the sake of love. My duty is to drive you out, so out you go." With this, he seized a garden fork and began jabbing it at the strangers, in order to force them to leave. Hank the mule was not afraid of the fork, and when he got his heels nearer to the gardener, the man fell back to avoid a kick. But now the roses crowded around the outcasts, and it was soon discovered that beneath their draperies of green leaves were many sharp thorns, which were more dangerous than Hank's heels. Neither Betsy nor Ozga nor Shaggy nor the mule cared to brave those thorns, and when they pressed away from them they found themselves slowly driven through the garden door into the greenhouse. From there they were forced out at the entrance, and so through the territory of the flower-strewn Rose Kingdom, which was not of very great extent. The Rose Princess was sobbing bitterly. Betsy was indignant and angry. Hank uttered defiant hee-haws, and the Shaggy Man whistled softly to himself. The boundary of the Rose Kingdom was a deep gulf, but there was a drawbridge in one place, and this the royal gardener let down until the outcasts had passed over it. Then he drew it up again and returned with his roses to the greenhouse, leaving the four queerly assorted comrades to wander into the bleak and unknown country that lay beyond.
"I don't mind much,"
remarked Shaggy as he led the way over the stony, barren ground.
"I've got to search for my long-lost little brother anyhow, so it won't matter where I go."
"Hank and I will help you find your brother," said Betsy in her most cheerful voice. I'm so far away from home now that I don't suppose I'll ever find my way back, and to tell you the truth, it's more fun traveling around and having adventures than sticking at home. Don't you think so, Hank?" "Hee-haw!" said Hank, and the Shaggy Man thanked them both. "For my part," said Princess Ozga of Roseland with a gentle sigh, "I must remain forever exiled from my kingdom, so I, too, will be glad to help the Shaggy Man find his lost brother."
"That's very kind of you, ma'am," said Shaggy. "But unless I can find the underground cavern of Ruggedo, the Metal Monarch, I shall never find poor brother."
This king was formerly named Roquat, but after he drank the waters of oblivion, he forgot his own name and had to take another. "Doesn't anyone know where it is?" inquired Betsy.
"Someone must know, of course," was Shaggy's reply. "But we are not the ones. The only way to succeed is for us to keep going until we find a person who can direct us to Ruggedo's cavern."
"We may find it ourselves without any help," suggested Betsy. "Who knows?"
"No one knows that except the person who's writing this story," said Shaggy. "But we won't find anything, not even supper, unless we travel on. Here's a path. Let's take it and see where it leads to."
End of Chapter 6. Recording by Scott Sherris, Atlanta, Georgia, USA. Chapter 7 of Tik-Tok of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Sherris. Tik-Tok of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 7. Polychrome's Pitiful Plight. The Rain King got too much water in his basin and spilled some over the brim. That made it rain in a certain part of the country, a real hard shower for a time, and sent the rainbow scampering to the place to show the gorgeous colors of his glorious bow as soon as the mist of the rain had passed and the sky was clear. The coming of the rainbow was always a joyous event to Earth folk, yet few have ever seen it close by. Usually the rainbow is so far distant that you can observe its splendid hues but dimly, and that is why we seldom catch sight of the dancing daughters of the rainbow. In the barren country where the rain had just fallen, there appeared to be no human beings at all, but the rainbow appeared just the same, and dancing gaily upon its arch were the rainbow's daughters, led by the fairy-like Polychrome, who was so dainty and beautiful that no girl has ever quite equaled her in loveliness. Polychrome was in a merry mood, and danced down the arch of the bow to the ground, daring her sisters to follow her. Laughing and gleeful, they also touched the ground with their twinkling feet, but all the daughters of the rainbow knew that this was a dangerous pastime, so they quickly climbed upon their bow again. All but Polychrome, though the sweetest and merriest of them all, she was likewise the most reckless. Moreover, it was an unusual sensation to pat the cold, damp earth with her rosy toes. Before she realized it, the bow had lifted and disappeared in the billowy blue sky, and here was Polychrome standing helpless upon a rock, her gauzy draperies floating about her like brilliant cobwebs, and not a soul, fairy or mortal, to help her regain her lost bow.
"Dear me,"
she exclaimed, a frown passing across her pretty face.
"I'm caught again. This is the second time my carelessness has left me on earth while my sisters returned to our sky palaces. The first time I enjoyed some pleasant adventures, but this is a lonely, forsaken country, and I shall be very unhappy until my rainbow comes again and I can climb aboard. Let me think what is best to be done."
She crouched low upon the flat rock, drew her draperies about her, and bowed her head. It was in this position that Betsy Bobbin spied Polychrome as she came along the stony path, followed by Hank, the princess, and Shaggy. At once the girl ran up to the radiant daughter of the rainbow and exclaimed,
"Oh, what a lovely, lovely creature!"
Polychrome raised her golden head. There were tears in her blue eyes.
"I'm the most miserable girl in the whole world," she sobbed.
The others gathered around her.
"Tell us your troubles, pretty one,"
urged the princess.
I've lost my bow,"
wailed Polychrome.
"Take me, my dear,"
said Shaggy Man in a sympathetic tone, thinking she meant bow instead of bow.
"I don't want you,"
cried Polychrome, stamping her foot imperiously.
"I want my rainbow."
"Oh, that's different," said Shaggy. "But try to forget it. When I was young, I used to cry for the rainbow myself, but I couldn't have it. Looks as if you couldn't have it either. So please don't cry."
Polychrome looked at him reproachfully. "I don't like you," she said.
"No?"
replied Shaggy, drawing the love magnet from his pocket.
"Not a little bit? Just a wee speck of a like?"
"Yes, yes!" said Polychrome, clasping her hands in ecstasy as she gazed at the enchanted talisman. "I love you, Shaggy Man."
"Of course you do,"
said he calmly.
"But I don't take any credit for it. It's the love magnet's powerful charm. But you seem quite alone and friendless, little Rainbow. Don't you want to join our party until you find your father and sisters again?"
"Where are you going?" she asked. "We don't just know that," said Betsy, taking her hand. "But we're trying to find Shaggy's long-lost brother, who's been captured by the terrible Metal Monarch. Won't you come with us and help us?" Polychrome looked from one to another of this queer party of travelers, and a bewitching smile suddenly lighted her face. "A donkey, a mortal maid, a rose princess, and a Shaggy Man!" she exclaimed. "Surely you need help if you intend to face Ruggedo." "Do you know him, then?" inquired Betsy. "No, indeed. Ruggedo's caverns are beneath the earth's surface, where no rainbow can ever penetrate. But I've heard of the Metal Monarch. He is also called the Gnome King, you know, and he has made trouble for a good many people, mortals and fairies, in his time," said Polychrome. "Do you fear him, then?" asked the princess anxiously. "No one can harm a daughter of the rainbow," said Polychrome proudly. "I'm a sky fairy." "Then," said Betsy quickly, "you'll be able to tell us the way to Ruggedo's cavern." "No," returned Polychrome, shaking her head. "That is one thing I cannot do, but I will gladly go with you and help you search for the place." This promise delighted all the wanderers, and after the Shaggy Man had found the path again, they began moving along it in a more happy mood. The Rainbow's Daughter danced lightly over the rocky trail, no longer sad, but with her beautiful features wreathed in smiles. Shaggy came next, walking steadily, and now and then supporting the Rose Princess, who followed him. Betsy and Hank brought up the rear, and if she tired with walking, the girl got upon Hank's back and let the stout little donkey carry her for a while. At nightfall, they came to some trees that grew beside a tiny brook, and here they made camp and rested until morning. Then away they tramped, finding berries and fruits here and there which satisfied the hunger of Betsy, Shaggy, and Hank, so that they were well content with their lot. It surprised Betty to see the Rose Princess partake of their food, for she considered her a fairy, but when she mentioned this to Polychrome, the Rainbow's Daughter explained that when Ozga was driven out of her Rose Kingdom, she ceased to be a fairy, and would never again be more than a mere mortal. Polychrome, however, was a fairy wherever she happened to be, and if she sipped a few dewdrops by moonlight for refreshment, no one ever saw her do it. As they continued their wandering journey, direction meant very little to them, for they were hopelessly lost in this strange country. Shaggy said it would be best to go toward the mountains, as the natural entrance to Ruggedo's underground cavern was likely to be hidden in some rocky, deserted place, but mountains seemed all around them, except in the one direction that they had come from, which led to the Rose Kingdom and the sea. Therefore it mattered little which way they traveled. By and by they espied a faint trail that looked like a path, and after following this for some time, they reached a crossroads. Here were many paths leading in various directions, and there was a signpost so old that there were now no words upon the sign. At one side was an old well with a chain windlass for drawing water, yet there was no house or other building anywhere in sight. While the party halted, puzzled which way to proceed, the mule approached the well and tried to look into it. "He's thirsty," said Betsy.
"It's a dry well," remarked Shaggy. "Probably there's been no water in it for many years. But come, let us decide which way to travel."
No one seemed to be able to decide that. They sat down in a group and tried to consider which road might be the best to take. Hank, however, could not keep away from the well, and finally he reared up on his hind legs, got his head over the edge, and uttered a loud "Hee-haw!" Betsy watched her animal friend curiously. "I wonder if he sees anything down there," she said. At this, Shaggy rose and went over to the well to investigate, and Betsy went with him. The princess and Polychrome, who had become fast friends, linked arms and sauntered down one of the roads to find an easy path.
"Really," said Shaggy, "there does seem to be something at the bottom of this old well."
"Can't we pull it up and see what it is?" asked the girl. There was no bucket at the end of the windlass chain, but there was a big hook that at one time was used to hold a bucket. Shaggy let down this hook, dragged it around on the bottom, and then pulled it up. An old hoop skirt came with it, and Betsy laughed and threw it away. The thing frightened Hank, who had never seen a hoop skirt before, and he kept a good distance away from it. Several other objects the Shaggy Man captured with the hook and drew up, but none of these was important.
"This well seems to have been the dump for all the old rubbish in this country," he said, letting down the hook once more. "I guess I've captured everything now. No, the hook is caught again. Help me, Betsy. Whatever this thing is, it's heavy."
She ran up and helped him turn the windlass, and after much effort a confused mass of copper came in sight.
"Good gracious!" exclaimed Shaggy. "Here is a surprise indeed."
"What is it?" inquired Betsy, clinging to the windlass and panting for breath. For answer, the Shaggy Man grasped the bundle of copper and dumped it upon the ground, free of the well. Then he turned it over with his foot, spread it out, and to Betsy's astonishment the thing proved to be a copper man.
"Just as I thought," said Shaggy, looking hard at the object. "But unless there are two copper men in the world, this is the most astonishing thing I ever came across."
At this moment the Rainbow's Daughter and the Rose Princess approached them, and Polychrome said,
"What have you found, Shaggy One?" "Either an old friend or a stranger," he replied.
"Oh, here's a sign on his back," cried Betsy, who had knelt down to examine the man. "Dear me, how funny! Listen to this." Then she read the following words engraved upon the copper plates of the man's body. "Smith & Tinker's patent double-action extra-responsive thought-creating perfect talking mechanical man, fitted with our special clockwork attachment, thinks, speaks, acts, and does everything but live."
"Isn't he wonderful?" exclaimed the princess.
"Yes, but here's more," said Betsy, reading from another engraved plate. "Directions for using. For thinking, wind the clockwork man under his left arm, marked number 1. For speaking, wind the clockwork man under his right arm, marked number 2. For walking and action, wind clockwork man in the middle of his back, marked number 3. Note well, this mechanism is guaranteed to work perfectly for 1,000 years.
"If he's guaranteed for 1,000 years," said Polychrome, "he ought to work yet." "Of course," replied Shaggy. "Let's wind him up."
In order to do this, they were obliged to set the copper man upon his feet in an upright position, and this was no easy task. He was inclined to topple over, and had to be propped again and again. The girls assisted Shaggy, and at last Tik-Tok seemed to be balanced and stood alone upon his broad feet.
"Yes," said
Shaggy, looking at the copper man carefully,
"this must be, indeed, my old friend Tik-Tok, whom I left ticking merrily in the land of Oz. But how he came to this lonely place and got into that old well is surely a mystery."
"If we wind him up, perhaps he will tell us," suggested Betsy. "Here's the key, hanging to a hook on his back. What part of him shall I wind up first?"
"His thoughts, of course," said Polychrome, "for it requires thought to speak or move intelligently."
So Betsy wound him under his left arm, and at once little flashes of light began to show in the top of his head, which was proof that he had begun to think.
"Now then," said Shaggy, "wind up his phonograph."
"What's that?" she asked.
"Why, his talking machine. His thoughts may be interesting, but they don't tell us anything."
So Betsy wound the copper man under his right arm, and then from the interior of his copper body came in jerky tones the words, "Many thanks."
"Hurrah!"
cried Shaggy joyfully, and he slapped Tik-Tok upon the back in such a hearty manner that the copper man lost his balance and tumbled to the ground in a heap. But the clockwork that enabled him to speak had been wound up, and he kept saying, "Pick me up, pick me up, pick me up," until they had again raised him and balanced him upon his feet, when he added politely, "Many thanks."
"He won't be self-supporting until we wind up his action,"
remarked Shaggy. So Betsy wound it as tight as she could, for the key turned rather hard, and then Tik-Tok lifted his feet, marched around in a circle, and ended by stopping before the group and making them all a low bow.
"How in the world did you happen to be in that well when I left you safe in Oz?"
inquired Shaggy. "It is a long story," replied Tik-Tok, "but I'll tell it in a few words. After you had gone in search of your brother, Ozma saw you wandering in the strange lands whenever she looked in her magic picture, and she also saw your brother in the Gnome King's cavern, so she sent me to tell you where to find your brother and told me to help you if I could. The sorceress Glinda the Good transported me to this place in the wink of an eye, but here I met the Gnome King himself, old Ruggedo, who is called in these parts the Metal Monarch. Ruggedo knew what I had come for, and he was so angry that he threw me down the well. After my works ran down, I was helpless until you came along and pulled me out again. Many thanks."
"That is indeed good news," said Shaggy. "I suspected that my brother was the prisoner of Ruggedo, but now I know it. Tell us, Tik-Tok, how shall we get to the Gnome King's underground cavern?"
"The best way is to walk," said Tik-Tok. "We might crawl or jump or roll over and over until we get there, but the best way is to walk."
"I know, but which road shall we take?"
"My machinery isn't made to tell that," replied Tik-Tok.
"There is more than one entrance to the underground cavern,"
said Polychrome.
"but old Ruggedo has cleverly concealed every opening so that earth dwellers cannot intrude in his domain. If we find our way underground at all, it will be by chance."
"Then," said Betsy, "let us select any road haphazard and see where it leads us."
"That seems sensible," declared the princess. "It may require a lot of time for us to find Ruggedo, but we have more time than anything else."
"If you keep me wound up," said Tik-Tok, "I will last 1,000 years."
"Then the only question to decide is which way to go,"
added Shaggy, looking first at one road and then at another. But while they stood hesitating, a peculiar sound reached their ears, a sound like the tramping of many feet. "What's coming?" cried Betsy, and then she ran to the left-hand road and glanced along the path.
"Why, it's an army!" she exclaimed. "What shall we do? Hide or run?"
"Stand still," commanded Shaggy. "I'm not afraid of an army. If they prove to be friendly, they can help us. If they are enemies, I'll show them the love magnet."
End of Chapter 7. Recording by Scott Sherris, Atlanta, Georgia, USA. Chapter 8 of Tik-Tok of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Sherris. Tik-Tok of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 8. Tik-Tok tackles a tough task. While Shaggy and his companions stood huddled in a group at one side, the army of Oogaboo was approaching along the pathway, the tramp of their feet being now and then accompanied by a dismal groan as one of the officers stepped on a sharp stone or knocked his funny bone against his neighbor's sword handle. Then, out from among the trees marched Private Files, bearing the banner of Oogaboo, which fluttered from a long pole. This pole he stuck in the ground just in front of the well, and then he cried in a loud voice, "I hereby conquer this territory in the name of Queen Ann so forth of Oogaboo, and all the inhabitants of the land I proclaim her slaves." Some of the officers now stuck their heads out of bushes and asked, "Is the coast clear, Private Files?" "There is no coast here," was the reply, "but all's well." "I hope there's water in it," said General Cone, mustering courage to advance to the well. But just then he caught a glimpse of Tik-Tok and Shaggy, and at once fell upon his knees, trembling and frightened, and cried out, "Mercy, kind enemies, mercy! Spare us, and we will be your slaves forever!" The other officers, who had now advanced into the clearing, likewise fell upon their knees and begged for mercy. Files turned around, and seeing the strangers for the first time, examined them with much curiosity. Then, discovering that 3 of the party were girls, he lifted his cap and made a polite bow.
"What's all this?"
demanded a harsh voice, as Queen Anne reached the place and beheld her kneeling army.
"Permit us to introduce ourselves," replied Shaggy, stepping forward. "This is Tik-Tok, the clockwork man, who works better than some meat people. And here is Princess Ozga of Roseland, just now unfortunately exiled from her kingdom of roses. I next present Polychrome, a sky fairy, who lost her bow by an accident and can't find her way home. The small girl here is Betsy Bobbin, from some unknown earthly paradise called Oklahoma. And with her you see Mr. Hank, a mule with a long tail and a short temper."
"Pah!"
said Anne scornfully.
"A pretty lot of vagabonds you are, indeed. All lost or strayed, I suppose, and not worth a queen's plundering. I'm sorry I've conquered you."
"But you haven't conquered us yet," called Betsy indignantly. "No," agreed Files, "that is a fact. But if my officers will kindly command me to conquer you, I will do so at once, after which we can stop arguing and converse more at our ease." The officers had by this time risen from their knees and brushed the dust from their trousers. To them, the enemy did not look very fierce, so the generals and colonels and majors and captains gained courage to face them, and began strutting in their most haughty manner.
"You must understand," said Anne, "that I am the Queen of Oogaboo, and this is my invincible army. We are busy conquering the world, and since you seem to be part of the world and are obstructing our journey, it is necessary for us to conquer you, unworthy though you may be of such high honor."
"That's all right," replied Shaggy. "Conquer us as often as you like. We don't mind."
"But we won't be anybody's slaves," added Betsy positively.
"We'll see about that," retorted the Queen angrily. "Advance, Private Files, and bind the enemy hand and foot."
But Private Files looked at pretty Betsy and fascinating Polychrome and the beautiful Rose Princess and shook his head. "It would be impolite, and I won't do it," he asserted.
"You must!" cried Anne. "It is your duty to obey orders."
"I haven't received any orders from my officers," objected the private. But the generals now shouted, "Forward and bind the prisoners!" And the colonels and majors and captains repeated the command, yelling it as loud as they could. All this noise annoyed Hank, who had been eyeing the army of Oogaboo with strong disfavor. The mule now dashed forward and began backing upon the officers and kicking fierce and dangerous heels at them. The attack was so sudden that the officers scattered like dust in a whirlwind, dropping their swords as they ran and trying to seek refuge behind trees and bushes. Betsy laughed joyously at the comical rout of the noble army, and Polychrome danced with glee, but Anne was furious at this ignoble defeat of her gallant forces by one small mule.
"Private Files, I command you to do your duty,"
she cried again, and then she herself ducked to escape the mule's heels, for Hank made no distinction in favor of a lady who was an open enemy. Betsy grabbed her champion by the forelock, however, and so held him fast, and when the officers saw that the mule was restrained from further attacks, they crept fearfully back and picked up their discarded swords.
"Private Files, seize and bind these prisoners!" screamed the Queen.
"No," said Files, throwing down his gun and removing the knapsack which was strapped to his back. "I resign my position as the army of Oogaboo. I enlisted to fight the enemy and become a hero, but if you want someone to bind harmless girls, you will have to hire another private." Then he walked over to the others and shook hands with Shaggy and Tik-Tok.
"Treason!"
shrieked Anne, and all the officers echoed her cry. "Nonsense," said Files. "I've the right to resign if I want to."
"Indeed you haven't," retorted the Queen. "If you resign, it will break up my army, and then I cannot conquer the world." She now turned to the officers and said, "I must ask you to do me a favor. I know it is undignified in officers to fight, but unless you immediately capture Private Files and force him to obey my orders, there will be no plunder for any of us.
Also, it is likely you will all suffer the pangs of hunger, and when we meet a powerful foe, you are liable to be captured and made slaves."
The prospect of this awful fate so frightened the officers that they drew their swords and rushed upon Files, who stood beside Shaggy in a truly ferocious manner. The next instant, however, they halted and again fell upon their knees, for there, before them, was the glistening Love Magnet, held in the hand of the smiling Shaggy Man, and the sight of this magic talisman at once won the heart of every Oogabooite. Even Anne saw the Love Magnet, and forgetting all enmity and anger, threw herself upon Shaggy and embraced him lovingly. Quite disconcerted by this unexpected effect of the magnet, Shaggy disengaged himself from the Queen's encircling arms, and quickly hid the talisman in his pocket. The adventurers from Oogaboo were now his firm friends, and there was no more talk about conquering and binding any of his party.
"If you insist on conquering anyone," said Shaggy, "you may march with me to the underground kingdom of Ruggedo. To conquer the world as you have set out to do, you must conquer everyone under its surface as well as those upon its surface, and no one in all the world needs conquering so much as Ruggedo."
"Who is he?"
asked Anne.
"The Metal Monarch, King of the Gnomes."
"Is he rich?" inquired Major Stockings in an anxious voice.
"Of course," answered Shaggy. "He owns all the metal that lies underground: gold, silver, copper, brass, and tin. He has an idea he also owns all the metals above ground, for he says all metal was once a part of his kingdom. So, by conquering the Metal Monarch, you will win all the riches in the world."
"Ah!" exclaimed General Apple, heaving a deep sigh. "That would be plunder worth our while. Let's conquer him, your Majesty." The Queen looked reproachfully at Files, who was sitting next to the lovely princess, and whispering in her ear.
"Alas!" said Anne, "I have no longer an army. I have plenty of brave officers indeed, but no private soldier for them to command. Therefore I cannot conquer Ruggedo and win all his wealth."
"Why don't you make one of your officers the private?"
asked Shaggy. But at once every officer began to protest, and the Queen of Oogaboo shook her head as she replied,
"That is impossible. A private soldier must be a terrible fighter, and my officers are unable to fight. They are exceptionally brave in commanding others to fight, but could not themselves meet the enemy and conquer."
"Very true, your Majesty," said Colonel Plum, eagerly. "There are many kinds of bravery, and one cannot be expected to possess them all. I myself am as brave as a lion in all ways until it comes to fighting, but then my nature revolts. Fighting is unkind and liable to be injurious to others, so, being a gentleman, I never fight." "Nor I!" shouted each of the other officers.
"You see," said Anne, "how helpless I am. Had not Private Files proved himself a traitor and a deserter, I would gladly have conquered this Ruggedo, but an army without a private soldier is like a bee without a stinger."
"I am not a traitor, your Majesty," protested Files. "I resigned in a proper manner, not liking the job, but there are plenty of people to take my place. Why not make Shaggy Man the private soldier?"
"He might be killed," said Anne, looking tenderly at Shaggy, "for he is mortal and able to die. If anything happened to him, it would break my heart."
"It would hurt me worse than that," declared Shaggy. "You must admit, your Majesty, that I am commander of this expedition, for it is my brother we are seeking rather than plunder. But I and my companions would like the assistance of your army, and if you help us to conquer Ruggedo and to rescue my brother from captivity, we will allow you to keep all the gold and jewels and other plunder you may find."
This prospect was so tempting that the officers began whispering together, and presently Colonel Cheese said, "Your Majesty, by combining our brains, we have just evolved a most brilliant idea. We will make the Clockwork Man the private soldier."
"Who, me?"
asked Tik-Tok.
"Not for a single second. I cannot fight, and you must not forget that it was Ruggedo who threw me in the well."
"At that time you had no gun," said Polychrome. "But if you join the army of Oogaboo, you will carry the gun that Mr. Files used."
"A soldier must be able to run as well as to fight," protested Tik-Tok. "And if my works run down as they often do, I could neither run nor fight."
"I'll keep you wound up, Tik-Tok," promised Betsy. "Why, it isn't a bad idea," said Shaggy. "Tik-Tok will make an ideal soldier, for nothing can injure him except a sledgehammer, and since a private soldier seems to be necessary to this army, Tik-Tok is the only one of our party fitted to undertake the job."
"What must I do?" asked Tik-Tok.
"Obey orders," replied Anne. "When the officers command you to do anything, you must do it. That is all."
"And that's enough, too," said Files. "Do I get a salary?" inquired Tik-Tok.
"You get your share of the plunder,"
answered the Queen. "Yes," remarked Files. "1/2 of the plunder goes to Queen Anne, the other half is divided among the officers, and the private gets the rest." "That will be satisfactory," said Tik-Tok, picking up the gun and examining it wonderingly, for he had never before seen such a weapon. Then Anne strapped the knapsack to Tik-Tok's copper back and said,
"Now we are ready to march to Ruggedo's kingdom and conquer it. Officers, give the command to march."
"Fall in!" yelled the generals, drawing their swords. "Fall in!" cried the colonels, drawing their swords. "Fall in!" shouted the majors, drawing their swords. "Fall in!" bawled the captains, drawing their swords. Tik-Tok looked at them and then around him in surprise. "Fall in what? The well?" he asked.
"No," said Queen Anne. "You must fall in marching order."
"Cannot I march without falling into it?" asked the Clockwork Man. "Shoulder your gun and stand ready to march," advised Files. So Tik-Tok held the gun straight and stood still. "What next?" he asked. The Queen turned to Shaggy.
"Which road leads to the Metal Monarch's cavern?"
"We don't know, your Majesty,"
was the reply.
"But this is absurd," said Anne with a frown. "If we can't get to Ruggedo, it is certain that we can't conquer him."
"You're right," admitted Shaggy. "But I did not say we could not get to him. We have only to discover the way, and that was the matter we were considering when you and your magnificent army arrived here."
"Well then, get busy and discover it,"
snapped the Queen. That was no easy task. They all stood looking from one road to another in perplexity. The paths radiated from the little clearing like the rays of the midday sun, and each path seemed like all the others. Files and the Rose Princess, who had by this time become good friends, advanced a little way along one of the roads and found that it was bordered by pretty wild flowers. "Why don't you ask the flowers to tell you the way?" he said to his companion.
"The flowers?"
returned the princess, surprised at the question.
"Of course," said Files. "The field flowers must be second cousins to the Rose Princess, and I believe if you ask them they will tell you."
She looked more closely at the flowers. There were hundreds of white daisies, golden buttercups, bluebells, and daffodils growing by the roadside, and each flower head was firmly set upon its slender but stout stem. There were even a few wild roses scattered here and there, and perhaps it was the sight of these that gave the princess courage to ask the important question. She dropped to her knees, facing the flowers, and extended both her arms pleadingly towards them.
"Tell me, pretty cousins," she said in her sweet, gentle voice, "which way will lead us to the kingdom of Ruggedo, the Gnome King?"
At once all the stems bent gracefully to the right, and the flower heads nodded once, twice, thrice in that direction.
"That's it!" cried Files joyfully. "Now we know the way!"
Ozga rose to her feet and looked wonderingly at the field flowers, which had now resumed their upright position. "Was it the wind, do you think?" she asked in a low whisper.
"No, indeed," replied Files. "There is not a breath of wind stirring. But these lovely blossoms are indeed your cousins, and answered your question at once, as I knew they would."
End of Chapter 8. Recording by Scott Sherris, Atlanta, Georgia, USA. Chapter 9 of Tik-Tok of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Sherris. Tik-Tok of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 9. Ruggedo's Rage is Rash and Reckless. The way taken by the adventurers led uphill and down dale, and wound here and there in a fashion that seemed aimless. But always it drew nearer to a range of low mountains, and Files said more than once that he was certain the entrance to Ruggedo's cavern would be found among these rugged hills. In this he was quite correct.
Far underneath the nearest mountain was a gorgeous chamber hollowed from the solid rock, the walls and roof of which glittered with thousands of magnificent jewels. Here, on a throne of virgin gold, sat the famous Gnome King, dressed in splendid robes and wearing a superb crown cut from a single blood-red ruby. Ruggedo, the monarch of all the metals and precious stones of the underground world, was a round little man with a flowing white beard, a red face, bright eyes, and a scowl that covered all his forehead. One would think, to look at him, that he ought to be jolly. One might think, considering his enormous wealth, that he ought to be happy, but this was not the case. The metal monarch was surly and cross, because mortals had dug so much treasure out of the earth and kept it above ground, where all the power of Ruggedo and his gnomes was unable to recover it. He hated not only the mortals, but also the fairies who live upon the earth or above it, and instead of being content with the riches he still possessed, he was unhappy because he did not own all the gold and jewels in the world. Ruggedo had been nodding, half asleep, in his chair, when suddenly he sat upright, uttered a roar of rage, and began pounding upon a huge gong that stood beside him. The sound filled the vast cavern and penetrated to many caverns beyond, where countless thousands of gnomes were working at their unending tasks, hammering out gold and silver and other metals, or melting ores in great furnaces, or polishing glittering gems. The gnomes trembled at the sound of the king's gong and whispered fearfully to one another that something unpleasant was sure to happen, but none dared pause in his task. The heavy curtains of cloth of gold were pushed aside, and Kaliko, the king's high chamberlain, entered the royal presence.
What's up, your majesty?"
he asked, with a wide yawn, for he had just wakened.
"Up!"
roared Ruggedo, stamping his foot viciously.
"Those foolish mortals are up, that's what! And they want to come down."
"Down here?" inquired Kaliko.
"Yes."
"How do you know?" continued the chamberlain, yawning again.
"I feel it in my bones," said Ruggedo. "I can always feel it when those hateful earth-crawlers draw near to my kingdom. I am positive, Kaliko, that mortals are this very minute on their way here to annoy me, and I hate mortals more than I do catnip tea."
"Well, what's to be done?" demanded the gnome.
"Look through your spyglass and see where the invaders are," commanded the king.
So Kaliko went to a tube in the wall of rock and put his eye to it. The tube ran from the cavern up to the side of the mountain, and turned several curves and corners, but as it was a magic spyglass, Kaliko was able to see through it just as easily as if it had been straight.
"Hum," said he. "I see 'em, your majesty."
"What do they look like?" inquired the monarch.
"That's a hard question to answer, for a queerer assortment of creatures I never yet beheld," replied the gnome. "However, such a collection of curiosities may prove dangerous. There's a copper man worked by machinery."
"Bah, that's only Tik-Tok," said Ruggedo. "I'm not afraid of him. Why, only the other day I met the fellow and threw him down a well."
"Then someone must have pulled him out again," said Kaliko. "And there's a little girl—"
"Dorothy?" asked
Ruggedo, jumping up in fear. "No, some other girl. In fact, there are several girls of various sizes, but Dorothy is not with them, nor is Ozma."
"That's good!"
exclaimed the king, sighing in relief. Kaliko still had his eye to the spyglass.
"I see," said he, "an army of men from Oogaboo. They are all officers and carry swords, and there is a shaggy man who seems very harmless, and a little donkey with big ears."
"Pooh!" cried Ruggedo, snapping his fingers in scorn. "I've no fear of such a mob as that. A dozen of my gnomes can destroy them all in a jiffy."
"I'm not so sure of that," said Kaliko. "The people of Oogaboo are hard to destroy, and I believe the Rose Princess is a fairy. As for Polychrome, you know very well that the Rainbow's daughter cannot be injured by a gnome."
"Polychrome? Is she among them?" asked the king.
"Yes, I have just recognized her."
"Then these people are coming here on no peaceful errand," declared Ruggedo, scowling fiercely. "In fact, no one ever comes here on a peaceful errand. I hate everyone, and everyone hates me."
"Very true," said Kaliko.
"I must in some way prevent these people from reaching my dominions. Where are they now?"
"Just now they are crossing the rubber country, your majesty."
"Good. Are your magnetic rubber wires in working order?"
"I think so," replied Kaliko. "Is it your royal will that we have some fun with these invaders?"
"It is," answered Ruggedo. "I want to teach them a lesson they will never forget."
Now, Shaggy had no idea that he was in a rubber country, nor had any of his companions. They noticed that everything around them was of a dull gray color, and that the path upon which they walked was soft and springy, yet they had no suspicion that the rocks and trees were rubber, and even the path they trod was made of rubber. Presently they came to a brook where sparkling water dashed through a deep channel and rushed away between high rocks far down the mountainside. Across the brook were stepping stones, so placed that travelers might easily leap from one to another, and in that manner cross the water to the farther bank. Tik-Tok was marching ahead, followed by his officers and Queen Anne. After them came Betsy Bobbin and Hank, Polychrome and Shaggy, and last of all the Rose Princess with Files. The Clockwork Man saw the stream and the stepping stones, and without making a pause placed his foot upon the first stone. The result was astonishing. First he sank down in the soft rubber, which then rebounded and sent Tik-Tok soaring high in the air, where he turned a succession of flip-flops and alighted upon a rubber rock far in the rear of the party. General Apple did not see Tik-Tok bound, so quickly had he disappeared. Therefore he also stepped upon the stone, which you will guess was connected with Kaliko's magnetic rubber wire, and instantly shot upward like an arrow. General Cone came next and met with a like fate, but the others now noticed that something was wrong, and with one accord they halted the column and looked back along the path. There was Tik-Tok, still bounding from one rubber rock to another, each time rising a less distance from the ground. And there was General Apple, bounding away in another direction, his three-cornered hat jammed over his eyes, and his long sword thumping him upon the arms and head as it swung this way and that. And there also appeared General Cone, who had struck a rubber rock head foremost, and was so crumpled up that his round body looked more like a bouncing ball than the form of a man. Betsy laughed merrily at the strange sight, and Polychrome echoed her laughter, but Ozga was grave and wondering, while Queen Anne became angry at seeing the chief officers of the army of Oogaboo bounding around in so undignified a manner. She shouted to them to stop, but they were unable to obey, even though they would have been glad to do so. Finally, however, they all ceased bounding and managed to get upon their feet and rejoin the army. "Why did you do that?" demanded Anne, who seemed greatly provoked.
"Don't ask them why," said Shaggy earnestly. "I knew you would ask them why, but you ought not to do it. The reason is plain. Those stones are rubber. Therefore they are not stones. Those rocks around us are rubber, and therefore they are not rocks. Even this path is not a path. It's rubber. Unless we are very careful, Your Majesty, we are all likely to get the bounce, just as your poor officers and Tik-Tok did."
"Then let's be careful," remarked Files, who was full of wisdom. But Polychrome wanted to test the quality of the rubber, so she began dancing. Every step sent her higher and higher into the air, so that she resembled a big butterfly fluttering lightly. Presently she made a great bound and bounded way across the stream, landing lightly and steadily on the other side.
"There is no rubber over here," she called to them. "Suppose you all try to bound over the stream without touching the stepping stones."
Anne and her officers were reluctant to undertake such a risky adventure, but Betsy at once grasped the value of the suggestion and began jumping up and down until she found herself bounding almost as high as Polychrome had done. Then she suddenly leaned forward, and the next bound took her easily across the brook, where she alighted by the side of the Rainbow's Daughter. "Come on, Hank!" called the girl, and the donkey tried to obey. He managed to bound pretty high, but when he tried to bound across the stream, he misjudged the distance and fell with a splash into the middle of the water. "Hee-haw!" he wailed, struggling toward the far bank. Betsy rushed forward to help him out, but when the mule stood safely beside her, she was amazed to find he was not wet at all.
"It's dry water," said Polychrome, dipping her hand into the stream and showing how the water fell from it and left it perfectly dry.
"In that case," returned Betsy, "they can all walk through the water." She called to Ozga and Shaggy to wade across, assuring them the water was shallow and would not wet them. At once they followed her advice, avoiding the rubber stepping stones, and made the crossing with ease. This encouraged the entire party to wade through the dry water, and in a few minutes all had assembled on the bank and renewed their journey along the path that led to the Gnome King's dominions.
When Kaliko again looked through his magic spyglass, he exclaimed,
"Bad luck, your majesty. All the invaders have passed the rubber country, and now are fast approaching the entrance to your caverns." Ruggedo raved and stormed at the news, and his anger was so great that several times, as he strode up and down his jeweled cavern, he paused to kick Kaliko upon his shins, which were so sensitive that the poor gnome howled with pain. Finally the king said, "There's no help for it. We must drop these audacious invaders down the hollow tube."
Kaliko gave a jump at this,
and looked at his master wonderingly. "If you do that, your majesty," he said, "you will make Tititi Hoochoo very angry."
"Never mind that," retorted Ruggedo. "Tititi Hoochoo lives on the other side of the world, so what do I care for his anger?"
Kaliko shuddered and uttered a little groan.
"Remember his terrible powers," he pleaded, "and remember that he warned you the last time you slid people through the hollow tube, that if you did it again, he would take vengeance upon you." The Metal Monarch walked up and down in silence, thinking deeper.
"Of two dangers," said he, "it is wise to choose the least. What do you suppose these invaders want?"
"Let the long-eared hearer listen to them," suggested Kaliko.
"Call him here at once,"
commanded Ruggedo eagerly. So in a few minutes there entered the cavern a gnome with enormous ears, who bowed low before the king.
"Strangers are approaching," said Ruggedo, "and I wish to know their errand. Listen carefully to their talk, and tell me why they are coming here and what for."
The gnome bowed again and spread out his great ears, swaying them gently up and down and back and forth. For half an hour he stood silent, in an attitude of listening, while both the king and Kaliko grew impatient at the delay. At last the long-eared hearer spoke. "Shaggyman is coming here to rescue his brother from captivity," said he.
"Ha, the ugly one!" exclaimed Ruggedo. "Well, Shaggy Man may have his ugly brother for all I care. He's too lazy to work and is always getting in my way. Where is the ugly one now, Kaliko?"
"The last time your majesty stumbled over the prisoner, you commanded me to send him to the Metal Forest, which I did. I suppose he is still there."
"Very good. The invaders will have a hard time finding the Metal Forest," said the king, with a grin of malicious delight. "For half the time I can't find it myself. Yet I created the forest and made every tree out of gold and silver, so as to keep the precious metals in a safe place and out of the reach of mortals. But tell me, hearer, do the strangers want anything else?"
"Yes, indeed they do," returned the gnome. "The army of Oogaboo is determined to capture all the rich metals and rare jewels in your kingdom, and the officers and their queen have arranged to divide the spoils and carry them away."
When he heard this, Ruggedo uttered a bellow of rage and began dancing up and down, rolling his eyes, clicking his teeth together, and swinging his arms furiously. Then, in an ecstasy of anger, he seized the long ears of the hearer and pulled and twisted them cruelly. But Kaliko grabbed up the king's scepter and rapped him over the knuckles with it, so that Ruggedo let go of the ears and began to chase his royal chamberlain around the throne. The hearer took advantage of this opportunity to slip away from the cavern and escape, and after the king had tired himself out chasing Kaliko, he threw himself into his throne and panted for breath, while he glared wickedly at his defiant subject. "You'd better save your strength to fight the enemy," suggested Kaliko. "There will be a terrible battle when the army of Oogaboo gets here."
"The army won't get here," said the king, still coughing and panting. "I'll drop 'em down the hollow tube, every man Jack and every girl Jill of 'em."
"And defy Tititi Hoochoo?"
asked Kaliko.
"Yes. Go at once to my chief magician and order him to turn the path toward the hollow tube and to make the tip of the tube invisible so they'll all fall into it."
Kaliko went away shaking his head,
for he thought Ruggedo was making a great mistake. He found the magician and had the path twisted so that it led directly to the opening of the hollow tube, and this opening he made invisible. Having obeyed the orders of his master, the royal chamberlain went to his private room and began to write letters of recommendation of himself, stating that he was an honest man, a good servant, and a small eater. "Pretty soon," he said to himself, "I shall have to look for another job, for it is certain that Ruggedo has ruined himself by this reckless defiance of the mighty Tititi Hoochoo, and in seeking a job nothing is so effective as a letter of recommendation." End of Chapter 9. Recording by Scott Sherris, Atlanta, Georgia, USA.
Chapter 10 of Tik-Tok of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Sherris. Tik-Tok of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 10. A Terrible Tumble Through a Tube. I suppose that Polychrome, and perhaps Queen Anne and her army, might have been able to dispel the enchantment of Ruggedo's chief magician had they known that danger lay in their pathway. For the Rainbow's Daughter was a fairy, and as Oogaboo is a part of the land of Oz, its inhabitants cannot be easily deceived by such common magic as the Gnome King could command. But no one suspected any especial danger until after they had entered Ruggedo's cavern, and so they were journeying along in quite a contented manner when Tik-Tok, who marched ahead, suddenly disappeared. The officers thought he must have turned a corner, so they kept on their way, and all of them likewise disappeared, one after another. Queen Anne was rather surprised at this, and in hastening forward to learn the reason, she also vanished from sight. Betsy Bobbin had tired her feet by walking, so she was now riding upon the back of the stout little mule, facing backwards and talking to Shaggy and Polychrome, who were just behind. Suddenly Hank pitched forward and began falling, and Betsy would have tumbled over his head had she not grabbed the mule's shaggy neck with both arms and held on for dear life. All around was darkness, and they were not falling directly downward, but seemed to be sliding along a steep incline. Hank's hoofs were resting upon some smooth substance over which he slid with the swiftness of the wind. Once Betsy's heels flew up and struck a similar substance overhead. They were indeed descending the hollow tube that led to the other side of the world. "Stop, Hank, stop!" cried the girl, but Hank only uttered a plaintive hee-haw, for it was impossible for him to obey. After several minutes had passed and no harm had befallen them, Betsy gained courage. She could see nothing at all, nor could she hear anything except the rush of air past her ears as they plunged downward along the tube. Whether she and Hank were alone, or the others were with them, she could not tell, but had someone been able to take a flashlight photograph of the tube at the time, a most curious picture would have resulted. There was Tik-Tok, flat upon his back and sliding head foremost down the incline, and there were the officers of the army of Oogaboo, all tangled up in a confused crowd, flapping their arms and trying to shield their faces from the clanking swords, which swung back and forth during the swift journey, and pummeled everyone within their reach. Now followed Queen Anne, who had struck the tube in a sitting position, and went flying along with a dash and abandon that thoroughly bewildered the poor lady, who had no idea what had happened to her. Then, a little distance away, but unseen by the others in the inky darkness, slid Betsy and Hank, while behind them were Shaggy and Polychrome, and finally Files and the Princess. When first they tumbled into the tube, all were too dazed to think clearly, but the trip was a long one, because the cavity led straight through the earth to a place just opposite the Gnome King's dominions, and long before the adventurers got to their end, they had begun to recover their wits. "This is awful, Hank!" cried Betsy in a loud voice, and Queen Anne heard her and called out, "Are you safe, Betsy?" "Mercy, no!" answered the little girl. "How could anyone be safe when she's going about 60 miles a minute?" Then, after a pause, she added, "But where do you suppose we're going to, your Majesty?"
"Don't ask her that, please don't,"
said Shaggy, who was not too far away to overhear them.
"And please don't ask me why, either."
"Why?" said Betsy.
"No one can tell where we're going until we get there,"
replied Shaggy, and then he yelled,
"Ouch!"
for Polychrome had overtaken them and was now sitting on his head. The Rainbow's Daughter laughed merrily, and so infectious was this joyous laugh that Betsy echoed it, and Hank said hee-haw in a mild and sympathetic tone of voice. "I'd just like to know where and when we'll arrive, just the same," exclaimed the little girl.
"Be patient and you'll find out, my dear," said Polychrome. "But isn't this an odd experience? Here am I, whose home is in the skies, making a journey through the center of the earth, where I never expected to be."
"How do you know we're in the center of the earth?" asked Betsy, her voice trembling a little through nervousness.
"Why, we can't be anywhere else," replied Polychrome. "I have often heard of this passage, which was once built by a magician who was a great traveler. He thought it would save him the bother of going around the earth's surface, but he tumbled through the tube so fast that he shot out at the other end and hit a star in the sky, which at once exploded.
The star exploded?
Asked Betsy wonderingly. Yes, the magician hit it so hard.
And what became of the magician? Inquired the girl.
No one knows that, answered Polychrome, but I don't think it matters much.
It matters a good deal if we also hit the stars when we come out,
said Queen Anne with a moan.
Don't worry, advised Polychrome. I believe the magician was going the other way, and probably he went much faster than we are going.
It's fast enough to suit me,
remarked Shaggy, gently removing Polychrome's heel from his left eye.
Couldn't you manage to fall all by yourself, my dear?
I'll try, laughed the Rainbow's Daughter.
All this time they were swiftly falling through the tube, and it was not so easy for them to talk as you may imagine when you read their words. But although they were so helpless and altogether in the dark as to their fate, the fact that they were able to converse at all cheered them considerably. Files and Ozga were also conversing as they clung tightly to one another, and the young fellow bravely strove to reassure the princess, although he was terribly frightened, both on her account and on his own. An hour, under such trying circumstances, is a very long time, and for more than an hour they continued their fearful journey. Then, just as they began to fear the tube would never end, Tik-Tok popped out into broad daylight, and after making a graceful circle in the air, fell with a splash into a great marble fountain. Out came the officers in quick succession, tumbling heels over head and striking the ground in many undignified attitudes. "For the love of sassafras!" exclaimed a peculiar person who was hoeing pink violets in a garden. "What can all this mean?" For answer, Queen Anne sailed up from the tube, took a ride through the air as high as the treetops, and alighted squarely on top of the peculiar person's head, smashing a jeweled crown over his eyes, and tumbling him to the ground. The mule was heavier and had Betsy clinging to his back, so he did not go so high up. Fortunately for his little rider, he struck the ground upon his 4 feet. Betsy was jarred a trifle, but not hurt, and when she looked around her, she saw the queen and the peculiar person struggling together upon the ground, where the man was trying to choke Anne, and she had both hands in his bushy hair and was pulling with all her might. Some of the officers, when they got upon their feet, hastened to separate the combatants and sought to restrain the peculiar person, so that he could not attack their queen again. By this time, Shaggy, Polychrome, Ozga, and Files had all arrived, and were curiously examining the strange country in which they found themselves, and which they knew to be exactly on the opposite side of the world from the place where they had fallen into the tube. It was a lovely place, indeed, and seemed to be the garden of some great prince, for through the vistas of trees and shrubbery could be seen the towers of an immense castle. But as yet the only inhabitant to greet them was the peculiar person just mentioned, who had shaken off the grasp of the officers without effort, and was now trying to pull the battered crown from off his eyes. Shaggy, who was always polite, helped him to do this, and when the man was free and could see again, he looked at his visitors with evident amazement. "Well, well, well!" he exclaimed. "Where did you come from, and how did you get here?" Betsy tried to answer him, for Queen Anne was surly and silent. "I can't say exactly where we came from, 'cause I don't know the name of the place," said the girl. "But the way we got here was through the hollow tube." "Don't call it a hollow tube, please," exclaimed the peculiar person in an irritated tone of voice. "If it's a tube, it's sure to be hollow." "Why?" asked Betsy. "Because all tubes are made that way. But this tube is private property, and everyone is forbidden to fall into it." "We didn't do it on purpose," exclaimed Betsy, and Polychrome added, "I am quite sure that Ruggedo, the Gnome King, pushed us down that tube." "Ha! Ruggedo! Did you say Ruggedo?" cried the man, becoming much excited.
"That is what she said," replied Shaggy, "and I believe she is right. We were on our way to conquer the Gnome King when suddenly we fell into the tube."
"Then you are enemies of Ruggedo?" inquired the peculiar person. "Not exactly enemies," said Betsy, a little puzzled by the question, "'cause we don't know him at all, but we started out to conquer him, which isn't as friendly as it might be." "True," agreed the man. He looked thoughtfully from one to another of them for a while, and then he turned his head over his shoulders and said,
"Never mind the fire and pincers, my good brothers. It will be best to take these strangers to the private citizen."
"Very well, Tubekins.
responded a voice, deep and powerful, that seemed to come out of the air, for the speaker was invisible. All our friends gave a jump at this. Even Polychrome was so startled that her gauze draperies fluttered like a banner in a breeze. Shaggy shook his head and sighed. Queen Anne looked very unhappy. The officers clung to each other, trembling violently. But soon they gained courage to look more closely at the peculiar person. As he was a type of all the inhabitants of this extraordinary land whom they afterward met, I will try to tell you what he looked like. His face was beautiful, but lacked expression. His eyes were large and blue in color, and his teeth finely formed and white as snow. His hair was black and bushy, and seemed inclined to curl at the ends. So far, no one could find any fault with his appearance. He wore a robe of scarlet, which did not cover his arms and extended no lower than his bare knees. On the bosom of the robe was embroidered a terrible dragon's head, as horrible to look at as the man was beautiful. His arms and legs were left bare, and the skin of one arm was bright yellow, and the skin of the other arm a vivid green. He had one blue leg and one pink one, while both his feet, which showed through the open sandals he wore, were jet black. Betsy could not decide whether these gorgeous colors were dyes or the natural tints of the skin. But while she was thinking it over, the man who had been called Tubekins said, "Follow me to the residence, all of you." But just then a voice exclaimed, "Here's another of them, Tubekins, lying in the water of the fountain."
"Gracious!" cried Betsy. "It must be Tik-Tok, and he'll drown."
"Water is a bad thing for his clockworks, anyway,"
agreed Shaggy, as with one accord they all started for the fountain. But before they could reach it, invisible hands raised Tik-Tok from the marble basin and set him upon his feet beside it, water dripping from every joint of his copper body.
"Many thanks,"
he said, and then his copper jaws clicked together, and he could say no more. He next made an attempt to walk, but after several awkward trials found he could not move his joints. Peals of jeering laughter from persons unseen greeted Tik-Tok's failure, and the new arrivals in this strange land found it very uncomfortable to realize that there were many creatures around them who were invisible, yet could be heard plainly.
"Shall I wind him up?" asked Betsy, feeling very sorry for Tik-Tok.
"I think his machinery is wound, but he needs oiling," replied Shaggy.
At once an oil can appeared before him, held on a level with his eyes by some unseen hand. Shaggy took the can and tried to oil Tik-Tok's joints. As if to assist him, a strong current of warm air was directed against the copper man, which quickly dried him. Soon he was able to say, "Many thanks," quite smoothly, and his joints worked fairly well. "Come!" commanded Tubekins, and turning his back upon them, he walked up the path toward the castle.
"Shall we go?"
asked Queen Anne, uncertainly, but just then she received a shove that almost pitched her forward on her head, so she decided to go. The officers who hesitated received several energetic kicks, but could not see who delivered them. Therefore they also decided, very wisely, to go. The others followed willingly enough, for unless they ventured upon another terrible journey through the tube, they must make the best of the unknown country they were in, and the best seemed to be to obey orders. End of Chapter 10. Recording by Scott Sherris, Atlanta, Georgia, USA.